child, lost in the fog, and I'm frightened of meeting all you known unknown.
Hello and welcome to Poly Risk Reward. My name's Ned Stranger, and in 2024, my wife and I received the results of a DNA paternity test that showed that I'm not our daughter's biological father. Through these podcasts, I tell the story of our open marriage and this unexpected twist in forensic detail, with each episode focusing on a common question I get about open marriage, polyamory, and this unusual situation.
As well as being a songwriter and unapologetic oversharer, I also identify as a recovering law student. Over 10 years ago, I did an undergrad and then a master's in law, and all the way through my adult life, these elements of law training kind of seep through into other aspects of what I do. And one of the things I remember learning during contract law was the importance of an offer and acceptance to form a contract. Now, what does this have to do with relationships? Well, I kind of feel like a relationship is basically a contract. It's an agreement between two people governed by a set of rules that determines how they interact with each other. And one of my pet hates, and I realize this is quite niche, is when you ask people when their relationship started and they don't have a clear answer. They sort of just fell into it. The reason this bothers me is because I think people have a lot of tension and get into a lot of arguments because of a lack of clarity around what their rules and their boundaries are in their relationship. And this starts right at the very beginning, if they don't even know that they're in it in the first place. Now, rules. Maybe not the most glamorous topic, but it is one of the most common questions I get asked in my relationship with Anya, which is like, what rules do you actually have? You know, we're in an open relationship, so the rule against dating other people isn't there. But that doesn't mean anything goes. There are certain things that are off limits. To put this all in context and return to the story, in the last episode I described how in Berlin in 2019, we reopened our relationship in that spring, and then a few years later, after 2 COVID lockdowns and living in some other cities, we ended up moving to Vienna. This was when we started dating people more regularly and needed to think about where the boundaries were in our relationship and specifically what the rules were. Before that, it was a process of trial and error. We'd get hurt. We'd talk a little bit about whether we should have something there in place. Whereas now we felt like we had to codify something a bit more structured. If you leave everything to chance, people just get hurt. It's not really clear where you stand, and you're always worrying that you're doing something wrong. Now, the big question is, what makes a good rule? And the flip side, what makes a bad rule? To borrow another concept from my law days, I like to think that a good rule has to fit 3 requirements, and these requirements are kind of in balance with one another. So you'll see that with a couple of examples. Firstly, a good rule has to be clear. This means that in any new situation, as much as possible, you can tell whether you're falling within the rule or breaking it. So an example would be a rule against dating your partner's friends. This only works if you have a really clear definition of what friends are. Otherwise, you might be in a situation where you want to date somebody, but you're not sure if they're a friend, or if friends includes like just really close friends or just anyone that your partner talks to occasionally, or whether it includes work colleagues, all these weird questions. So that's one element of the rule. It has to be clear. Secondly, a rule has to be like easy to comply with. And this means that you're not placing unfair restrictions on your partner by creating something that they're just not going to be able to do. So an example of this might be not allowing your partner to date somebody unless they've filled out some complicated questionnaire, character assessment of that person, or only allowing your partner to date somebody and have to have sex with them after they've been on 10 dates with them, or something like really over the top. I think that these kinds of rules are actually unhealthy jealousy masquerading as boundaries. So I think a good rule is easy enough to comply with that it's not just placing extra restrictions and effort on your partner. Thirdly, and probably most importantly, I think a rule has to have a really good reason, like a good justification. And the philosophy in our marriage, and this is something that's developed over time, is that we like to place as little restriction on one another as possible. Like, our marriage is built on freedom and this recognition that we're both individuals with our own needs and our own desires, And freedom fits into that, whereas restriction is some kind of control on that. And so a rule has to be really justified. So through our dating life in Vienna, we tried out several new rules and ended up rejecting them because they didn't fit this test, the Ned test, as I'm now going to call it, although that's definitely not going to catch because it's not a catchy name. One example is a rule where you're not allowed to bring people home to the apartment. And I know some couples that have this rule because they feel like their apartment is their own like personal space. And on one level, it's a very clear rule. It's very defined. The apartment is obviously the apartment, and you don't bring a date back inside. Very simple. The thing is, like, sometimes this was actually not very convenient. If I was meeting somebody nearby and they lived really far away, or for whatever reason their apartment was off limits, maybe because they had kids or they lived with someone, this seemed to be the only easy way, other than maybe booking a hotel, of, getting laid. That being said, not impossible to comply with. The real question is, how justified is this rule? And we decided that, in theory, there was no real problem with it. Like, neither of us had a problem with sharing our space with other people, as long as it was kind of within reason and only when it was really necessary, and we weren't just being complete strangers home without trusting that they were like good people and not going to steal all of Anya's hats, of which she has many.
And you don't know
So I already talked about one example, which is the rule against not dating friends. And in theory, this was relatively justified because, it can get emotionally complicated if your partner is getting involved with your best friend and whatever. And again, there's like 8 billion people in the world. You don't have to date your friends, right? That said, we also thought that it was quite unclear because, like, where do you draw the lines? Like I said earlier, is it just close friends? Is it any acquaintance? And what we found was that it was far easier to talk on a case-by-case basis. And if one of us had the desire to date a particular person, that we could have a conversation about that. And so we never felt like we needed a clear rule about that. It would be more like something that we would talk about and as a bit of a custom, if that makes sense. And as we'll see in the story, this became relevant later on. Now I could spend hours just coming up with fake rules and trying to work out whether or not they would pass the test. And that's exactly the kind of thing I did all the way through my law degree. But for now, the key thing to really understand is that most rules are, in my opinion, too much. And you're setting too much restriction and too many boundaries on your partner when the whole point is you're supposed to give them freedom and individuality and independence. I think this is also true for monogamous relationships, but there is a clear rule against sexual or even emotional intimacy with other people. Now, in my opinion, that can all get very confusing. It's very unclear, and however justified it might be, I think it's often very hard to comply with, which is why so many people cheat. However, I'm not making this podcast into a referendum on open relationships versus closed relationships. For now, I just kind of wanted to introduce the idea of rules and thinking about them in a lot more depth. And next week, I'm going to be talking about the only 2 rules that we do have. So we only have 2 rules in our marriage. And the first of them, in particular, was sparked by a very funny story and a massive fail that I had on my very first date with a dating app in Vienna. So, stay tuned for that. For now, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Poly Risk Reward. My name is Ned Stranger, and the more loyal listeners will have noticed that I've been playing around a little bit with the format, and I've added a bit more new music in. All of the music that I've used is my original songs, and please, if you haven't already, tell your friends about the podcast. I'd really love to grow it to more people and start the conversation. If you have any feedback, I've been incrementally trying to improve these, so I'd love any positive feedback or whatever about how it's going. And remember to leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. And I'll see you next time. Thank you again for listening to Poly Risk Reward.